It's like evidence-based therapies. This isn't about a teacher taking the time to go in and tell some war stories about their life. It's about going through a curriculum that has empirical data supporting the fact that this does teach the child, the teenager, whatever, information they need to recognize and react to situations in a timely way.
100%. Because when I talk about my own experiences with, attempting to take my own life, it's not about me. It's about using my story to get them to think about the choices and the decisions that they're making in their lives. And this is a practice that we developed. So I became the director of outreach at the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign in 2002. The National Mental Health Awareness Campaign, you probably remember, was launched by the Clinton administration in 99, and it was the first public health approach to mental health. So what a lot of people don't know is from 2002 to 2006, we went out and researched what were the most effective, responsible ways for people to share their stories about mental health. And I worked with researchers at NIMH, and I worked with people who were in, really high levels, mental health professionals, so that we were doing it responsibly. And then we were able to launch the first Youth Mental Health Awareness Speakers Bureau based off of the evidence-based ways of how you actually share your story in a way that allows people to think about their own lives. So not only are you saying it from a perspective of not being war stories, Dr. Phil, this is something we have practiced for 2 decades. This isn't new. This isn't us coming out of left field and being like, hey, let's do this. The same trainings that I did to create the first large-scale mental health presentations in this country are what we're doing with teachers today. It's not something that we're just throwing at the wall.
And they want to know. The teachers want to know they don't want to go in and make this stuff up on their own.
No.
They want to put the dots close together and connect them with a bright red line so they don't feel like, am I getting where I don't belong here? This is a tried and proven program. I was reading a study, you've probably seen it, but it was published in the Biological Psychiatry Global Open Science, and they compared brains of young people pre and post pandemic and have determined that these teen brains aged during the pandemic at a much faster rate than for a like period when they did not go through the pandemic, and not in a positive way. It isn't that they matured.
Yeah, right. They didn't myelinate their neural pathways.
No, they aged, and they compared scans of the physical structures of their brains before and after the pandemic. And they knew going in that they had higher levels of depression and anxiety and fearfulness, but what they didn't know was the effects of the brain. And so they looked at MRI scans. They found thinning of the tissues in the cortex, which, as we know, is the planning and executive function and all foresight, the ability to see the consequences of their action. When they really dug down, they saw changes that can result in higher risk of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, a lot of things because of how the brain is reacting. So this is not something that is likely to cure up in a short period of time. Now, the brain is very resilient. There's no question about that. And with the proper kind of nurturance and good sleep and good nutrition, these brains potentially can recover. That's why I say this is a longitudinal problem. If everything that we can do to support them behaviorally, mentally, and emotionally is going to support recovery brain-wise, it just all fits together. My question to you is, we started talking about the tech happening. Do you know Dan Siegel by any chance?
Of course.
He's on our advisory board here and is a really valued colleague of mine. We've talked about this some, and as I said, these college kids now that have an attitude where I guess about 2013, 2014, was kind of the first time they started medicalizing their complaints. They started saying, this professor said some things I disagreed with, that hurt me, made me feel unsafe, made me whatever. So we've seen more professors dismissed from student complaints in the last several years than we've seen since the McCarthy era from students complaining. Now, I haven't studied these on a case-by-case basis, although I've looked at several. Not all professors are great. Some of them probably cross some lines, but a lot of them, it was ideological. It had to do with asking students to take the law enforcement side in the George Floyd situation, or a side that was contrary to their core beliefs, which I thought was how you learned, how you resolved cognitive dissonance, how you looked at the other side, how you broadened your scope. And studies show anywhere between 15 and 30% of students think it's okay to yell down a speaker on campus that you disagree with. Stunning to me.
Yeah, it's a big change. Yeah.
A big change. Are we coddling them too much?
And what's the line between coddling and empowering, right?
Exactly.
Because at some point you want them to speak up. You know, there are certain issues in our society today that are based on people's identity markers, and if you have an identity marker that is getting legislated or changed that's out of your control, you want them to feel empowered to be like, hey, this isn't right, and I want to change. But on the flip side, you also want them to understand that there are different perspectives, there are different viewpoints that impact your life, and how do you balance those two? In the cases you're sharing, it sounds like we're going to an extreme in one way of not just empowering. We're coddling to the point of like, you don't ever have to face this or realize this or experience this. I know that at UCLA's College Counseling Center, there are 54 college counselors now. And most of the concerns that come in are not about mental health disorders. They can't talk to a roommate. They can't ask someone on a date. They don't know how to manage basic life skills. So I don't have the specific answer to if we're coddling them in regards to social justice issues or speech, looking at different perspectives from a college professor. But I do know that life skills in general are lacking. And I do know that at my school, the idea was, what if we started teaching these life skills from grade 6 through grade 12 so that when they get to college, they're not going to the counseling center to figure this out. They're having a conversation with real people in their life, because we can teach about conflict resolution and all these other things that they're relying on adults for. So it's probably, much like you're saying, a combination of things, not just a quick one-off answer, but it's complicated.
And I'm not saying that they should agree with a professor or that they should be penalized if they don't agree with the professor.
Right.
But do you get him or her fired because they presented a point of view that's offensive to your sensibilities? People ask me a lot of times, what would I say is the job of a parent? There's 1,000 ways you could describe that, but I think one of the broadest ways is to prepare the child for the next level of life.
Yeah.
When they're in kindergarten, you're preparing them to face the challenges that you face in kindergarten. But when they move up the ladder and they're having to be more independent in their study and stuff, that you prepare them to be more responsible and organized. And when they start getting into social situations, you really want to focus on their self-worth and their self-esteem, but you're preparing them for the next level of life. And right now, I wonder if some parents and universities are failing to prepare these young people for what the world is going to expect, because whether you like it or not, this still is a meritocracy. They're going to be competing, and if they're not willing to do things that don't fit their ideological value-based position, they could wind up in a pretty menial job if they don't have the flexibility to not change their views, but accommodate those who disagree.
There's also a difference between canceling and calling in.
Right.
And when I have these conversations with my students, they know these differences really well. And they'll say, in a lot of ways, canceling one doesn't always exist because somebody ends up somewhere, right? But the aspect of calling someone in can lead to more restorative healing than just removing someone entirely. Obviously, if someone does something egregious, I think we both agree, like that's just, there's no place for that.
Right.
But what you're saying of preparing them for the future, if we set up a system where everyone thinks if I complain about this, then I'm not going to have to ever see it in my life, we're not setting that person up for success. And when you talk to, especially when I talk to young people who are victims of this in different ways, because gender dynamics play out in a specific way, especially in middle schools and high schools, a lot of times they do want that person to be called in, and they do want them to understand so that that person also grows for the future too and understands, oh, I wasn't aware that that's not something I can say. Now, obviously there are cases where someone is more than well-versed knowing that they shouldn't say that thing and they say it. So I think that at least my experience with this younger generation is that they do want to have an opportunity to talk this out and see what can happen. You're talking about when a system of structure or power takes even that away from them and just says, we're removing this person. And that's problematic.